So, we're going to take a shot at this today. Stick with me. If you need to nod off, then if I can help, I'm happy to do that. I always say that. So, all right. Let's start out with a definition of Scandinavia, because some people may not have thought about that. Technically, Scandinavia includes only Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, which is the red that you see here. Denmark, Norway, Sweden. Now, in common language, especially in English-speaking countries, we often will include Iceland, Finland, the Faroe Islands, and the Åland Islands. This, of course, is Iceland. This is the Faroe Islands, Finland, and those are the Åland Islands right there. They used to belong to Finland. They're now independent. So we often will include that. Technically, when you're referring to all of those countries, they are called the Norden, or the Nordic countries, because of being in the north. But as I say, technically, it only really includes Sweden, Norway, and Denmark. But again, we include things. Now, one of the reasons for that is because of the language similarities. I don't know if you're aware of it or have thought about it, but prior to the development of DNA analysis, the only way we could tell how people groups were related to one another is through their language. And so tracing the similarities, the links between languages, has always been very, very important, because that's how you can tell where people came from, because their language had similarities to people from Central Asia or Eastern Europe or wherever. Now we have DNA analysis, but there's still a big emphasis on language connections. Danish, Swedish, and Norwegian are considered mutually intelligible languages. They are all Norse languages, which come out of Old German. They have, when they say mutually intelligible, it's because somebody who speaks one of those languages usually can understand the other. Iceland, the Icelandic language, and the island of the Faroe Islands are considered insular Norse languages, which means they were separated, completely separated for long enough that it's difficult for them to understand but they get a little bit of that. They can understand some, they're related clearly, but it's not the same. You had a question?
No, I just thought I heard music coming through the speakers.
Oh,
there. I don't know.
it's just the nature of my voice, I think.
So musical.
It was a joke. So there have been, and again, these countries all started with common roots from Germany, from the Germanic people, so I'm going to show you a little bit of that in a minute. But there have at various times been movements called Scandinavism, which have advocated the countries of Scandinavia, especially again, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden, joining together into one. In fact, in 1839, Hans Christian Andersen, the famous Danish writer, you know, The Little Mermaid and The Little Match Girl, I always cry when I read that story, The Little Match Girl, he traveled to Sweden. And having spent some time in Sweden and also got to know some Norwegians, he went back to Denmark and wrote a poem called I Am a Scandinavian. And in defending this poem, he wrote, we are all one people called Scandinavians. This was in the 1830s. The 18th century and 19th century were periods of time in which there was a strong emphasis on trying to join these countries together because of their similarities. Common descent, similarities in language, common culture in many ways. Ancient religious beliefs were common. They've all been Christianized now. But this has been an issue for a very long time. Finnish, on the other hand, the reason that Finland is not considered technically part of Scandinavia, although we usually include it in general conversation, is because the Finnish language is fundamentally different. Finnish, the closest similarity we have to Finnish, there's a little bit of similarity amongst the Sami languages, what we call Laplanders, although that's not considered a politically correct term anymore. But the Samis and the Sami peoples in Finland have some similarities, but Finnish is closest to Hungarian. Because while it was German peoples from down here that came up and moved into Denmark, Sweden, and Norway, the Finnish people over here actually came from Eastern Europe, and they believed prior to that Central Asia. And so they have a different language base, a different origin. Finland has always had a closer tie, you know, probably because of being conquered so many times, to Russia than to even the Scandinavian countries. But we still think of it as Scandinavia. The earliest evidence that we have of people in Scandinavia is back in the Bronze Age, and again, Germanic peoples came up from Germany. They began here in an area of northern Germany called Schleswig-Holstein, moved up into Denmark and crossed over into the southern part of what we know as Sweden and Norway. The name Scandinavia comes from an area, which is reflected here, it's actually right there, called Scania, which was an ancient term. It actually was a separate political division early on, and so Scania is what gives us the title Scandinavia. That goes all the way back to Pliny the Elder. Some of the old Roman writers talked about this part of the world using those terms. And again, we have evidence from the Bronze Age, petroglyphs and things of that sort. I mentioned when I talked about the Vikings, we have old artwork which represents how early the earliest of the Norwegian vessels were created. So we have that indication from the Bronze Age. If you were in my first talk on the Vikings, then you will remember the Viking Age was from, we believe, 793, which was the year that the monastery at Lindisfarne was attacked, the first great raid of the Vikings, to 1066, which was the Battle of Hastings and the Norman conquest of England. And since the Normans, William the Conqueror and his followers, were only 155 years from their original Nordic ancestry that settled in France, that sort of ended the Viking Age. So that period, end of the 700s to the mid-1000s, is the Viking Age. And during that time, as we talked about before, Scandinavian peoples explored, traded, raided, and colonized large parts of Europe, Western Europe, and Eastern Europe. Again, the Swedes particularly focused on traveling down the river systems into Eastern Europe, Russia, some of those areas. They also settled and colonized the Mediterranean, the Middle East, North Africa, as far away as Newfoundland. Leif Erikson established a community in what's now Newfoundland, Lansall Meadows community. We have clear evidence of that, and there are suggestions in other parts of the West Coast and of the western part of Canada that there may have been other communities that branched off of that. All of those eventually died out. They believe it may have been because of opposition from First Peoples or Native American groups. Until the late 9th century, most of this area were just petty kingdoms. For instance, in one of the first to really kind of get organized at the end of the 9th century, so we're talking the end of the 800s, there was a man named Harald Fairhair. I think Felipe mentioned him the other night as being seen as sort of the father of Norway. Well, there are all these petty kingdoms, and he was one of these petty kings. He asked a woman named Gita to marry him. Gita was pretty proud of herself. Apparently we've got several women that were kind of the keys to some major things happening here. Gita said she would not marry any petty king, and that if Harald Fairhair wanted her as his wife, then he had to conquer all of Norway. Well, she must have been something, because he spent the next 8 years doing exactly that. He conquered all of the other petty kingdoms so that he ended up creating a unified Norway. And particularly, he is seen as the father of modern Norway. They used to say that the date was probably 872 when this happened. Nowadays, they're thinking it may be closer to 900, more recent scholarship. But as we go into Bergen Harbor, depending upon the exact way we go, pulling into Bergen, there's an island that we will pass, which is called the island of Hawkinson. Hawkinson Island has on it a monument which has a 50-foot tall red granite spire, which it was put there to celebrate the 1000th anniversary of the unification of Norway under Harald Fairhair. So if we're close enough to it, you should be able to see that. It's 50 feet tall. So this is where they sort of got started in terms of unifying these countries. It wasn't until well into the Viking Age that they ended up having any kind of sense of being countries. We think of Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Norway. They were all just Northmen at that point. There was not a strong difference between them at all. And Harald Fairhair in Norway was one of the first ones to establish that. Christianity ended up coming to Scandinavia much later than most of the rest of Europe. In fact, during the Viking Age, one of the big challenges was that they were raiding in England and Scotland and Ireland and Western France, all of which were Christianized and had been for a while, since the Roman times. But they were all still following the Old Norse gods, which we'll talk about tomorrow, and when we talk about myths and legends of the North. But in Denmark, Harald Bluetooth. Does Bluetooth sound familiar? Bluetooth was a Danish king who unified Denmark much the same way that Harald Fairhair unified Norway, by conquering other kingdoms. Well, the Bluetooth technology that you have in your phone and your laptop was created by Ericsson Communication, which is a Scandinavian country. And it was named Bluetooth because Bluetooth connected all of the different parts of Denmark. And so Harald Bluetooth did that. And so Bluetooth connects different devices. That's where that expression comes from Harald Bluetooth. So he brought Christianity into the country, into Denmark in the late 900s, around 980. He ruled for almost 50 years, which was a very long time back then. And finally he was killed in battle by his own son, whose name was Sven Forkbeard. They had great names back then, you know. I should grow mine out and split it, you know, Ross Forkbeard. I think that'd be cool. Anyway, Sven Forkbeard defeated his father, killed him in battle, took over as the ruler of Denmark, and then, because he was not satisfied with that, he tried to invade England. And again, this was during the time of the Viking Age. He rowed up the Thames River to London, pulled down the, using grappling hooks, they pulled down the London Bridge. You all know the song, London Bridge is Falling Down? That's because of Sven Forkbeard and his guys in the late 900s. So they, when they pulled down London Bridge and were threatening London, the King of England at that point was named Ethelred II, but he went by the title Ethelred the Unready. Okay. Not all the names were that flattering, like Charles the Simple and Charles the Fat and Charles the Bald and all these other guys. But Ethelred the Unready paid Danegeld, or Danish money, to get Sven Forkbeard. Hello? Something just cut out. Sven Forkbeard to leave. And by the way, I should have said this too. Because we have sail away at 5 o'clock, at some point the captain may come on and announce that it's going to happen, and my mic will cut out, and we'll all just smile and listen to the captain as long as it takes, okay? And we'll be fine. Anyway, Sven, after he got paid Danegeld and destroyed the London Bridge, he went back to Denmark, but in his absence, to his misfortune, King Eric, who is called Eric the Victorious, who was ruler over Sweden. See how this all gets, you know, back and forth? The ruler of Sweden had taken over Denmark in Sven's absence. And so Sven comes back and is trying to fight his way back into Denmark. Eric, the guy from Sweden who has taken over Denmark, dies. His son, whose name was Olaf, took over. Olaf tried to make peace with Sven. He said, look, you're in, you can have Denmark, I'll stay in Sweden, we'll get along. In fact, if you would like, you may marry my mother, my father's wife. And her name was Sigrid the Proud. So he said, you can even marry Sigrid, and we'll sort of make a tie between our two countries that way rather than fighting about it. Well, Sigrid was also being courted by the very handsome, debonair king of Norway, whose name was Olaf Tryggvason. Olaf Tryggvason is the one that introduced Christianity into Norway. And in fact, he recruited Leif Erikson, the Leif Erikson, who also had become a Christian, to help him bring Christianity back to Norway. Well, Olaf Tryggvason was quite the character. He is described by one chronicler as, and I'm quoting here, the most wildly beautifulest man in all the annals of Norway.
Wow.
The most wildly beautifulest man in all the annals of Norway. So he was courting Sigrid the Proud. But Sigrid was a pagan. Olaf was a Christian. So Olaf said, I want you to be baptized. I want you to become a Christian. Sigrid said no. So Olaf slapped her with his glove. I mean, he didn't strike her with his fist, but he slapped her with his glove and said, "You are as heathen as a dog." And she said, "That will be your death." So Sigrid ends up marrying Sven Forkbeard, who is in charge of Denmark. Her son is the king of Norway. So she gets her new husband and her son to join forces to attack Olaf of Norway. Okay, so Sweden and Denmark follow Sigrid's lead and attack Norway, and Olaf is killed. You can't tell the players without a scorecard. I probably should have a chart up here for all of this stuff. But from that point on, after Olaf was defeated, Norway gets divided up between Denmark and Sweden. It's broken up. Olaf, while he's been killed, later on in 1015, his son Olaf II comes back, regains power, takes the throne of Norway, and he continues bringing in English missionaries to Christianize all of Norway. By this time, all three kingdoms, Sweden, Norway, and Denmark, have all been Christianized. Now, those three kingdoms start really taking shape as separate entities about this time, even though there's still a lot of trading back and forth. In Norway, there's a character named Harald Hardrada. Hardrada basically means hard case, a hard ruler. Harald Hardrada, who had served on the Varangian Guard, it was called, as one of the guards of the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople, he came back, had conquered Norway. He ended up going to England in 1066. You recognize that date? The King of England, Harald Godwinson, was waiting for William the Conqueror. He wasn't the Conqueror then, he was called William the Bastard from Normandy, waiting for him to land on the southern coast. When, lo and behold, Harald Hardrada, with his Nordic army, lands in the north of England. So Harald Godwinson has to run north, fight a battle, and Harald Hardrada is killed in that battle. And then, as soon as that battle's over, they find out that William has landed on the south coast. So they have to travel 5 more days to the south, get there exhausted, and Harald Godwinson is defeated by William of Normandy. And that's the Norman invasion. Harald Hardrada is one of the reasons why all of that happened, because he was a distraction right as this was all occurring. But during this time, there is still fighting back and forth between the various countries. And another key, I should have put this up here, Norway, Sweden, Denmark, Finland. Obviously you know what those are. But back and forth all along the way. We then had another player comes on the scene. They were called the Hanseatic League, or the Hanse. They were German merchants that began down in Germany. They set up their headquarters in Lübeck in northern Germany. Of course, this is Denmark right here, so they're right there. And then they established trading posts in key cities. They had trading posts in Novgorod in Russia, in Riga, on the island of Visby, Danzig. Bergen was a major center for them, and when you get to Bergen, you can visit the Hanseatic headquarters called the Bryggen, which is within walking distance of our boat. It's a fascinating historic area, as well as Hamburg, London, Bruges, Cologne, others. What they did was they would come into these areas and they would set up their own community. And to be a member of the Hanseatic League, you had to go through this almost trial by fire, and in order to be accepted. And they ended up having their own navy, their own army, their own diplomatic corps. They controlled much of the trade in the Baltic and Northern Europe for many, many years. They were one of the most powerful forces in that period of time. I'm not going to get into a lot of detail about that, because I'm going to do a talk later on in the cruise about the Hanseatic League. In fact, right before we get to Bergen. So you'll know what you're looking at when you see Bryggen, this sort of community. They actually were not allowed to interact with the local people. Although fascinatingly enough, in Bergen, the street that had all the prostitutes on it was immediately adjacent to the trading center for the Hanseatic League. I mention them though because they come into play here in a very significant way. As we move along. A character I have to mention to you, King Magnus Eriksson IV of Sweden and the 7th of Norway. You have a lot of shared thrones in here. In 1319, Magnus was only 3 years old when he was elected the King of Sweden. And one of the things, too, about these countries, the kings were, according to the rules of the nations, is this too loud?
No, it's good.
Are you all okay?
Yeah.
I see you holding your ears. I don't want to be too loud. Are we okay back there? All of the countries in what we know as Scandinavia elected their kings. And the kings that got elected, almost in every case, tried to create a situation where their sons could be kings after them. Not just because they wanted their sons to be kings, but also because they felt like that would establish greater authority in the monarchy. Throughout Scandinavia, most especially in Sweden, slightly less so in Norway, there was always a conflict between the monarchs, the kings and queens, who wanted to create a very strong central government and power and authority in the monarch, and the local nobility in the church, who did not want the monarch to be so strong because they wanted to have more control, and they felt it was either or. And so you have all of this conflict going upon between the nobles. Sweden was the biggest example, and between the kings. The nobles opposed having a hereditary kingship because they felt like that would give too much power to one family. Well, Magnus comes along. He's only 3 years old. He's elected the King of Sweden. The same year, his grandfather, who is King Håkon of Norway, dies, and he is named the King of Norway. He's 3 years old. He's the King of Sweden and the King of Norway. Yes?
Why would he be elected king at 3 years old? Was his father king?
Well, it's because of who he descended from. His father had been king, but there was no rule that he had to be king after that. Usually in a situation like that, and we have several cases here, in fact his mother, Margaret, I'm going to talk about in a minute, they would say, this person is from the right family, their father performed well, we want this person to be king, we'll elect them king at 3 years old, or 17 years old in one case, but they will have a regent who will rule in their stead, either a parent, an uncle, somebody else who actually is the power behind the throne until they come of age, in which case they take over the authority. And that's what they did in this case. There was a regent who was actually in charge of running things during this time when after Magnus was elected as king. But it had to do a lot with the political machinations of what family people came from and all of that. The nobles might want to elect somebody at 3 years old as king in order to keep somebody else from being elected to that position. So there are a lot of different reasons for that. Well, when Magnus came of age in 1332, Sweden was doing really, really well. They were very prosperous, they were strong, but Denmark was nearing collapse. They were bankrupt, they had been selling off parts of their country to other countries in order to keep enough money to keep things running. And so Denmark was in awful shape. Sweden, and therefore Norway, because they were under the same leadership, were doing quite well. But then in 1340, a new king came into Denmark named King Valdemar IV Attertag, just Valdemar is what we just refer to him as. He came to the Danish throne. He was strong. He put together an army and he started throwing people out of his country. All these people that had bought parts of Denmark, he threw them out. Well, one of the other things he did was he defied the Hanseatic League, and he confiscated some of their property. So the Hanseatic League ended up an enemy of his, and they were not somebody you wanted as an enemy. So you have Magnus, who is a very successful ruler now, even as a young man, in Sweden and Norway. You have Valdemar, who is having a horrible time of it because his country was shaken up. Was poor, he had to win military battles, and then he's fighting the Hanseatic League. Then, in 1349, this is right at the time that Valdemar has finally thrown all of his enemies out of Denmark, the bubonic plague hits. 1349 was the worst of the plagues in Europe. It entered into Scandinavia through the port of Bergen, and actually, as I recall the story, they will say that an English merchant put into port in Bergen, but in fact it was the ship sort of floated into Bergen and everybody on board was dead. It had a hold full of wolves and things from Britain, including rats. The rats jumped off the ship. People started being infected. It started in Bergen. It spread through Norway and killed 2/3 of the population of the country. It crossed over into Sweden and killed thousands and thousands of people there. That became the whole issue of what these countries were about for a very long period of time. And it was very difficult for them, including Magnus, to maintain authority when such devastation was striking the country. Over the next 20 years, there's all sorts of various kinds of chicanery and maneuvering between Magnus and between Valdemar in Denmark, etc., marrying one another's relatives. Valdemar, finally, he offends the Catholic Church by confiscating some of their property. So he's got the Catholic Church. The Swedish nobility are afraid that he's going to infect Sweden, so they're against him. The Hanseatic League is his enemy because he confiscated some of their property, so he's really having problems. But to try to resolve all of these issues, Valdemar's daughter, whose name was Margaret, ended up marrying the son of Magnus, whose name was Hakon, and the two of them, married together, brought the three countries back together again. At this point, the Hanseatic League won some major battles against Denmark, and they ended up controlling a large part of Denmark. They didn't own it, but they controlled it. They got all of the 2/3 of the financial benefit of those areas for 15 years. They had the right to approve or disapprove the new monarchs in Denmark. They had fortresses that they controlled. They had significant power. Well, this woman, this is actually the death model from Queen Margaret. Queen Margaret was the daughter of Valdemar of Denmark. She married Hakon, who was the son of the king and became king eventually of Sweden and Norway. So the three of them, three countries, are united under Margaret and her husband Hakon. Eventually Hakon dies. She is one of the most important and most powerful women in European history, certainly, that gets very little recognition. She, in terms of her impact, was equivalent to Elizabeth I or Catherine the Great, and yet most people don't know about her. She arranges, first she starts taking action against the Hanseatic League to keep them out of the Baltic, because they're controlling all of this stuff. And she's successful at that. She ends up getting her son Olaf to inherit all three of the crowns, Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. But Olaf unfortunately dies in 1387, and she is named regent because everybody recognizes she is the smart one. She's the one that knows how to do things. One of the reasons they made her regent is because Scandinavia, all of Scandinavia, was being threatened at that time, most especially Sweden, by a bunch of Germans under Albert of Mecklenburg. And they said to Margaret, if you help us get rid of Albert of Mecklenburg, we will make you regent. And she did. She organized the army, she put everything together, she launched the campaign that defeated the Germans, drove them back out, and things went very well. One of the things that Margaret did was she helped create what was called the Kalmar Union. Again, she was the regent over Norway, over Sweden, and over Denmark. But they also incorporated parts of Finland, Iceland, and Greenland, as well as the Faroe Islands and some others, the Shetland Islands and Faroe Islands, into a union specifically, not because they weren't joined as a country, but they joined together in treaty to fight against the Hanseatic League, to keep them from taking over control of all of the Baltic region, which is what they were trying to do, and all of the North Sea. Because most of the the furs and iron and so many other products came out of the Baltic. And so it was very important to control the Baltic area. The Kalmar Union was invented or created primarily by Margaret in order to keep the Hanseatic League from taking control of all that. Eventually, in 1523, which is the date that the Hanseatic League, or the Kalmar Union, ended, we have a fellow come along named Gustav Vasa from Sweden, another very important character in history. Vasa, his story starts with Prince Christian of the son of King John of Denmark and Norway. Christian was a ruthless tyrant, and he was trying to take over Sweden to control it like he did Denmark and Norway. And he did several things. He invited the nobility from Sweden to a banquet. They got there, he had the local archbishop declare that 18 of the leaders of Sweden were heretics, and they were taken out and executed. He agreed to meet with the regent of Sweden, but the regent was afraid to meet with him, and he said, I'll tell you what, we'll meet in a neutral place, and just so you don't, we'll meet in Sweden, but just so you don't take advantage of me, I need you to send hostages. We'll hold the hostages until after the meeting, and if you don't do anything wrong, we'll release the hostages. Well, they sent the hostages, he put them on a boat and took them back to Denmark, and held them in prison. Very ruthless, untrustworthy kind of guy. Well, one of the people that he held as a hostage during that time was named Gustav Vasa. He was from a very well-to-do royal family in Sweden, very powerful. He escaped Danish custody in 1519, and during this time there was a lot of battles going on, but it looked like Prince Christian, who had become King Christian, was going to win in Sweden. Vasa goes back to Sweden undercover, starts organizing armies undercover, starts intimidating and fighting back against the Danish-Norwegian army that's trying to take over Sweden, and is having great success. They informally declare that he is the king of Sweden and the Dales, an area that he was particularly working in. And the army that he forms ends up being supported by the Hanseatic League, because they still had heartburn about Denmark and all they were doing. So the Hanseatic League supports him. They break free of the Danish control, and he gets the support from the nobles and the clergy and everyone in Sweden, and he is named King Gustav Vasa, Gustavus Vasa. This image down here, you can recognize him. He's the guy in the funny clothes. This image of a woman being grabbed in the orange dress and taken in into court. The orange dress represents the Catholic Church, because one of the things that Vasa, when he was made king, recognized was the Catholic Church is controlling 21% of all of the productive farmland in Sweden. The Protestant Reformation has already happened by this time. Early 1500s was when Martin Luther nailed the 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Cathedral. So the Reformation is moving forward. Vasa declares separation of the nation of Sweden from the Catholic Church and from the papacy, and that they are now a Lutheran country. And he gets the clergy, because they had been oppressed by the church, they felt, and all of the nobility in Sweden to agree with him, because he was already beginning to rebuild the country, and they really felt good about him. So they broke off, and the Lutheran Church was established as the official church in Sweden. Today, the Lutheran Church is by far the dominant church in all of the Scandinavian countries. 77% of all Norwegians are Lutheran, for an example. So Vasa was the one that really did that. He captured, so to speak, the Catholic Church and brought them to task, ended up really enriching the country, but also especially enriching the throne by being successful in gaining control of a lot of that land that was being used by the church. He also, through the Hanseatic League, he went to war against the Hanseatic League and threw them out of the areas that he controlled in Sweden. So they gained money from that as well, because they were getting the product that the Hanseatic League had previously done. This is the grandson of Gustav Vasa. His name was Gustavus Adolphus. He became king over Sweden, which was at that point controlling Finland, part of Norway, and also the Estonian or the Baltic republics, as well as a little bit of northern Germany. He comes in during the time when the Reformation is really being challenged. The 30 Years' War has come along, and at this point, in terms of having been Lutheran for 2 generations, Sweden was one of the most powerful of the Protestant countries when the 30 Years' War is happening. The 30-Year War was an effort by the Habsburg Empire, which was Catholic, and the Holy Roman Emperor, who was part of the Habsburg Empire and Catholic, and the Spanish Catholics to try to force all of the Protestants to become Catholic again. Well, Gustavus Adolphus, the grandson of Gustav Vasa, became the hero of the Protestant Reformation in Sweden. He ended up creating a professional military, very disciplined, very committed to their faith, and he was quite something. He was very personable, everybody liked him. He was called the Golden King because he was tall and fair-haired and broad. He spoke, get this, German, Latin, Italian, Dutch, Polish, Russian, and Spanish, as well as, of course, Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish. So he was brilliant, and he was also a great military strategist. He ended up, over a period of time, not only marching down into northern Germany and defeating the Catholic armies and becoming the hero of the whole Protestant Reformation in many ways, but he also fought against Denmark, Russia, and Poland, and ended up emerging Sweden as the most powerful country in Europe. This was the period of time which is called the Stormaktstiden. Stormaktstiden means the golden era, or the era of power for Sweden. And they ended up, during Gustav Adolphus's reign, taking over all the rest of Norway, much of Russia, Poland, northern Germany. This was, as well as Iceland and Greenland. It became not only the most powerful military force in Europe, but the largest empire in Europe, all under Gustavus Adolphus. And again, most people don't think of Sweden as being a great military power because they had been neutral during almost all of the 20th century from various wars. But under him, he did extraordinary things. He built, as I said, the professional army, and the people that fought for him were called the Karolians. This is another image, by the way, of the map of what they controlled all the way down into this area. This is to start with, but they ended up taking over Poland, Prussia, Lithuania, and this parts of Russia later on. In the 30 Years' War, he was the hero, as I said, and had it not been for him, the Protestants would have lost some major battles against the Holy Roman Empire, and probably Catholicism would have been successful in suppressing Protestantism in Germany and some of the northern European countries. But one of the reasons that he was so successful is that his army was called, the Swedish army was called the Karolians. The Karolians were all very pious, very religious, very disciplined. And Gustavus Adolphus came up with a very different strategy for war. Back then, everybody had muskets. Muskets are horribly inaccurate. You know, you simply cannot hit a target with them more than 30 feet away or something. And they were very slow to reload. So his soldiers, the Karolians, were so disciplined that they would march in formation up very close to the enemy, even if the enemy was shooting at them, knowing that they're going to take some losses, and they would get close enough, they would fire one shot, close enough to have an effect, and then they wouldn't try to reload. They would rush in hand to hand, and they were defeating armies everywhere. They defeated Russian armies, they defeated Danish armies, they had phenomenal success. They were very, very disciplined, even under very harsh circumstances, partly because they were very pious. They saw the king, Gustavus, as being God's own emissary, and they believed it was not possible, if they were serving God's purpose, to lose a battle. And so they would never retreat unless it was simply to regroup, and they would never surrender. They also had a very strict discipline. Anybody in the army, they didn't loot, they didn't rape, they didn't do any of the things that most of the armies back then, which were mostly mercenary armies, would do. They were very religious. And yet, if anybody was caught raping or looting, committing adultery, drinking on duty, falling asleep on duty, or surrendering, the penalty was execution in front of the rest of the army. And they all knew that. Is that the captain? Somebody just cut me out. Well, until he starts talking, I'll continue talking. Can you still hear me in the back? Yes. Okay, I'll just project. So these Karolians ended up suffering terribly, especially in what was called the Great Northern War. But this is the success that Sweden had. They conquered not only Sweden and the Baltic republics, they actually controlled Russia at one point. They down into northern Germany as well. So much so that the Great Northern War was a battle in which Peter the First of Russia, who is Peter the Great, joined forces with Poland, with Prussia, and also with several other European powers in order to try to defeat Sweden, since they were so powerful. They had a brand new king that had come in Sweden, who was Charles the 12th. He actually took power when he was only 17 years old. The next year, Russia and the other allied powers invaded Sweden. Much to their surprise and chagrin, Charles, even though he's a very young man, proved to be an excellent general. And he defeated the Russian army, the Polish army, the other allies. So much so the Great Northern War was fought from 1700 to 1721, and in fact Charles the 12th of Sweden had been so successful early on that he decided he was going to march all the way to Moscow. They had already gained control of much of Russia, but Peter the Great was still in Moscow, and he was leading the Allied effort to try to defeat Sweden. Charles ended up biting off more than he could chew. The effort to try to march all the way across to Moscow was too much. He ended up being cut off and defeated at the Battle of Moldova in 1709. And because he and his army were cut off, they were forced to go south. And when they went south, they ended up in the Ottoman Empire. He was welcomed as a guest of the Ottoman Empire, but he kept insisting that the Ottomans should join him and fight the Russians to get rid of them as an influence, because the Ottomans were kind of concerned about the Russians as well. They were next door neighbors. The Ottomans at first did not want to go to war, but Charles kept agitating and agitating, and he got a bunch of people to support him, including the mother of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. And finally they agreed that they would go to battle on Charles's behalf, and the Ottoman army actually defeated the Russian army. But once they defeated them, they then said, that's enough, we're done. And Charles was livid. He said, why didn't you pursue them? You won a battle, why didn't you go after them and end this thing? And he created had such a conniption fit that they said, you know, why don't you find someplace else to live? You know, we don't want to have anything else to do with you. It's also true that the Karolians, as his soldiers, as good as they had been for a long time, they ended up sort of losing their moral compass, and they were beginning to be problematic in the Ottoman Empire. Of course, at that point it was Muslim, and they had very tight, very strict morals. And so Charles ended up going back to Sweden. He got there just as Sweden was being divided up between Russia and Prussia and the various other powers, never to be reunited again. Sweden ended up suffering greatly under the peace treaties because they basically were from a position of weakness at that point. And he ended up living the last few years of his life pretty much a broken man. Sweden, that was the last battle. They actually had a brief battle, a war with Norway, because at one point after that, the Danish ceded Norway to Denmark without bothering to tell the Norwegians. And so the Norwegians refused, and there was a battle between Sweden and Norway, and they ended up agreeing to be separate countries and getting along all right. That was the last war that Sweden fought in, after having been the greatest military power in Europe. They were neutral throughout the entire 20th century, most of the 19th century and the 20th century. They were neutral in the First and Second World Wars, and they continued to approach that international relations with that attitude today. I'm almost done. In the 18th century, one other thing happened. The Danish Empire became the first global empire in the world. Previously, when they had empires, they were almost always contiguous, meaning the countries that they controlled were next to each other. The Danes not only were controlling Norway at that point, as well as Iceland and part of Greenland, but they established a presence in North America. They had a presence on the Delaware River in the U.S. for a long time. They also controlled areas of Central America, South America, in Africa, and over into some of the Asian, particularly trading islands and things over there. So Denmark became, while it wasn't a huge empire, they still had a presence. They were the first global empire in history. And in the 19th century, Sweden ended up with one of the marshals of Napoleon, Bernadotte, who ended up taking a name as the king there. He came in and really led the Swedes through a very difficult time, reestablished them, regained their prosperity. He actually joined with the Danes to fight against Denmark, but the Swedes tried to maintain as much neutrality and not be involved in that as they could. And after this, as I say, they completely were neutral. This is one of the stave churches. We saw one today, not this one, but very similar. If you went on the stave church visit. In 1837, a Scandinavian immigrant to Illinois named Ole Renning published a book in Sweden and Norway which was called A True Account of America for the Information and Help of Peasants and Commoners. It became a bestseller in Sweden and Norway. Everybody was fascinated by these accounts of what it was like in America. And so, because this was right before the Civil War, not a whole lot happened until after the Civil War. But after the Civil War in the United States ended, some Scandinavians started immigrating to the U.S. It was a trickle at first, but eventually there was a flood of immigrants, especially from Sweden and Norway. Between 1837 and 1935, well over 860,000 Norwegians. Now remember, this is a country that at that point only had about 4 million people. So we're talking about almost a fourth of the population immigrated to the United States. Between 1851 and 1910, over 950,000 Swedes immigrated to the US and Canada. And today, 1.5% of the US population is of Norwegian heritage, 1.4% is of Swedish heritage, and 0.5%, including my wife, are of Danish heritage. And so there's a huge Scandinavian presence in the United States, as I'm sure you know, the odds are that some of you are of Scandinavian descent. That may be why you're on this trip, visiting Norway. That's one of the reasons I think that there's such popularity for things like Garrison Keillor's Prairie Home Companion. You know, all these Norwegian bachelor farmers. You know, the Lake Wobegon kind of idea, this Midwestern Scandinavian presence that exists. And of course the popularity of Sven and Ole jokes. You know Sven and Ole jokes? I think that people really like them because they're well-intentioned. You know, they're sort of innocent ignorance. Like Sven and Ole went to a funeral, and Sven could not remember the name of the guy who died. And he's trying to remember, and he turns to his friend Sven, or whichever one, Ole. Yeah, Sven turns to Ole and says, "Ole, I can't remember the guy who died. Who was it?" And Ole says, "I'm not sure, but I think it's the guy in the box." You know, there are thousands and thousands of those kinds of jokes because and those would not really make sense. Sven and Ole and Lena jokes. You know, another one was that Sven was on his deathbed. You know, they were surprised he'd lasted as long as he was. He was right at the point of taking his last breath. He's in bed and he smells his favorite cookies having just been baked. So with his last bit of energy, he drags himself out of bed and he drags himself into the kitchen and he reaches up on the counter and he takes a cookie and he takes a bite. And Lena, his wife, comes in the kitchen, slaps his hand and says, "What are you doing? Those are for after the funeral." So anyway, any questions about, I am sorry for the amount of detail in this. I couldn't figure out how to get from point A to point B without a lot of that, so I apologize for it. Questions? Yes?
Do you know about this Viking Finger?
The Viking Finger?
Anyway, there it is. Bent finger.
Oh, the bent finger? Okay.
The village from the Alabama. And apparently this, an actual bed is the smallest finger.
Okay. So who has a bent small finger? Do you have a bent small finger?
No.
Okay.
Well, I've always
Interesting.
had it.
You've always had it?
Yeah, one of my nephews had it.
Oh, interesting.
It's only on one hand.
Huh. Fascinating.
Yeah.
I'd never heard of that. So who has a bent small finger? There you go. Yeah, if you do that, I think that's different. But any other questions about any of this? thank you all very much. This is the most difficult of the talks I'll do. Tomorrow we'll talk about myths and legends of the North.